the immigration point you've made, which is, what route do you take? Is it the Japanese way of, closing ranks and remaining at ease with your national culture and everything that goes with it, and who knows what the future holds? Or is it, as the West has done, which is, mass immigration? It's a huge hot topic at the moment, particularly in Britain and the United States, both of which are seeing record numbers of people and locking themselves in for large demographic changes. And it's not very popular, to say the least, amongst most people out of the thinking classes. And I think partly for the cultural reasons which you've alluded to, which is, I had Paul Embry on the show saying there seem to be millions of people in this country who are feeling culturally unstable. They're unsure about what they are anymore. So what is the alternative to keeping the tap of mass immigration turning on? Is it a cultural movement that shows care for a national culture and history? Is it pro-natalist policies? What are the various routes if it's not Japan?
Well, I wrote in the book Tomorrow's People about the trilemma, and in fact that I've now done some work with an economist called Philip Pilkington on quantifying that trilemma. And the trilemma effectively is it's Israel, Japan, or Britain. To put it very crudely, Japan, you have small families, and you don't want mass immigration. You want ethnic homogeneity. You value that highly, although there is now some immigration in Japan. But that's traditionally been the Japanese stance. And what happens is your dependency ratio gets worse and worse. You get more and more old people relative to the population. The population eventually declines. Just to tell you that in a number, when Japan reached 100 million people in the 60s, there were 5 or 6 people of working age to every retiree. And then it went up. When it goes down to 100 million fairly soon in 20 or 30 years, instead of 5 or 6 workers to everyone over 65, there'll be almost 1 to 1. So how that sort of society works, how you can fund pensions, how you can actually provide healthcare, it's a financial and it's a labor force problem. And as I've said, we already see Japanese debt levels way over double those of the UK. And the economic implications, I'm not an economist, but clearly you can't fund that forever. And you simply can't run a society on that basis. And of course, you get villages that are disappearing, small towns that are depopulating, thousands of people every year with no descendants living in their flat. There's a whole industry in Japan of defumigating flats where people have died and bodies have been left for months. So all sorts of nasty implications. And forget the idea of people looking after the elderly. If you don't have the money, the state won't have the money. And if you don't have the money to employ someone, millions of people will die neglected. So and the country will shrivel. And like Japan has become less and less relevant. I'm old enough to remember when it was the land of the rising sun. Everyone thought Japan was the future. Nobody thinks that now. How you raise the armed forces, which I think we need more than we thought perhaps 20 years ago, how you staff all sorts of sectors of the economy becomes a problem. So that's the Japanese way. The British way is to say, as in Japan, we don't want to have very large families. I mean, again, the fertility rate's been higher in Britain than Japan, but it's been below replacement for 50 years. So we're choosing that low fertility, but we don't want that economic shriveling. We want somehow to supply labor to our different sectors. It's very interesting. When I was growing up in the 80s, there was very high unemployment. That's not the case today. And today we have shortages in almost every sector, whether you're talking about the schools or the army, almost every business I know, they're short of workers just about everywhere. And you can throw money at one sector, but it's whack-a-mole. You're going to lose workers somewhere else. So we, again, because our dependency ratio is shifting, not yet to Japanese levels, but in a negative direction. And the way that we've solved that is mass immigration. And I think there's a real limit to how far you can go on that. First of all, there is a reaction against it, and not everybody is comfortable living in an extremely multi-ethnic society. And I think there are advantages to diversity, but there are also advantages to homogeneity. The difference being that we can all and are all encouraged to celebrate diversity, but we can barely even discuss the advantages of homogeneity. Whereas in East Asia, nobody's interested in diversity. It's not even a subject for discussion. Of course, we want to remain Koreans, or of course, we want to remain ethnically Japanese. So I think that's something that should be discussed for sure. But in Britain, our solution is to have this mass immigration. Now, traditionally, in Great Britain, we've had huge immigration from Ireland. The fertility rate in Ireland has dropped enormously. And of course, Irish economy no longer means people have to leave to get decent jobs and a decent living standard. The same's happening in Poland. A huge reduction in the number of 20-somethings in Poland compared to 20, 30 years ago. And that will keep falling as the Polish fertility rate is low. And so we will have to get our labor from countries, the remaining countries with high fertility rates, which are poor. And those won't necessarily be people with a high value added ability, given their education levels. And they may be people who are more difficult to integrate into the nation as they come from further afield and from cultures that are further removed from ours, and probably have very low levels of education. So that's the root of mass immigration, giving rise to all sorts of issues and questions. And work done by Eric Kaufman, Matt Goodwin, has shown quite conclusively that the whole Brexit issue and debate and vote was very much driven by migration, even if Brexiteers are now disappointed. It was certainly something that I thought at the time. One of the reasons that I voted to remain in the EU, with mixed feelings, was that I thought that EU immigrants, my own parents are from Germany, and I think immigrants from Europe are easier for a whole range of reasons to integrate. So if we were going to have immigration, I'd rather have had it from Europe. But I accept, given the demography of Europe, that was not a long-term plan. There are also other reasons we shouldn't over-rely on immigration. Take, for example, Ghana. We have a huge reliance on Ghanaian healthcare workers and social care workers. And it's said, although it's hard to prove it, that there are more health workers from Ghana working in Britain than in Ghana. Now, Ghana's a poor country. Having a child, bringing up that child, educating that child, and getting that child to the level of actually a medical qualification is a huge investment. And for us to say, well, we're busy and important, we won't have children, you get on with it, Ghana, and if we want your kids, they've got the right qualifications, we'll skim them off. And I know investors in sub-Saharan Africa who say this is a real issue. There really are problems in manning businesses and all sorts of sectors of the economy in several African countries when the best and the brightest are skimmed off and taken off to Europe. So that I have real issues with the Japanese solution, and I have real issues with the British solution. I don't think either of them are long-term solutions. And you can't say, not every country can say, we'll be sub-replacement and we'll bring in immigrants from elsewhere. China can't do it. It's not nearly big enough. It's not rich enough. It doesn't have the cultural pull. People don't speak Chinese in Africa and the high fertility countries. But they also, the wages China would offer are low. And of course, China's so big that it would have to be hoovering up whole populations to make a difference. So it's not an answer to the world's fertility problem to say somewhere else will have the kids and we don't have to worry. It may be a stopgap, but until we can start importing people from Mars or somewhere, that's not a global solution. So I don't buy the British solution or the Japanese solution. And I think the only fix is the Israeli solution, which is a developed, advanced society with similar levels of education to ours, a very urban society, and yet a society that has 3 children per woman. And the reason why I focus on Israel is because it's the only country that seems to have cracked this issue, that it's become modern, and yet by modern, by which I specifically mean urban, educated and wealthy, and yet it manages to produce 3 children per woman. And that is, I think, the answer. Now, that doesn't mean I've got a recipe or a set of policies that we can just cut and paste and say, right, and then our fertility rate will be 3. But I think what it does mean is it gives us hope that just because we have reached a certain level of modernity does not inevitably mean that we are going to have to face either mass immigration forever and become airstrip 1, just a country where an ever aging population is just supported by more and more people coming from elsewhere. Those immigrants, of course, get old in turn. So it becomes some massive Ponzi scheme where you just pour people into the country to support the elderly from the previous generation who came. I mean, that's not a model for any sort of country. So the answer has to be, and this is the subject of my book that's coming out in July, my fourth book, No One Left. The answer has to be somehow to get our fertility rates up. When I was born in the I'm a very, very late baby boomer by 6 weeks. I was mid-November 64. It was a big boom cohort, and then it started to fall almost immediately afterwards. And I don't think it should be impossible for us to get, from a demographic point of view, it seems incredible when countries like Hungary put so much effort in to get their fertility rate from 1.2 to 1.5. A demographer feels that that's a huge mountain to climb. But in society generally, if you said to people, oh, an average of 2 to 3 children, it's not only feasible, I think, but it's what most people, men and women in most developed countries, say they want.